Wow, this is great. Welcome, everyone, to the 97th Annual Faculty Research Lecture 2010. Since 1913, Berkeley's Academic Senate has honored faculty members for their exceptionally distinguished scholarship by offering a celebrated public forum for the presentation of scholarly research of the highest caliber. These public lectures give the campus community an opportunity to hear from some of our finest faculty. They showcase and allow us to enjoy Berkeley's comprehensive excellence from the arts and humanities through the social sciences, and the professions. Past lecturers include many campus notables. I'm delighted to introduce some distinguished prior faculty research lecturers who are here with us today. And actually, if you came in after I got this list, please identify yourself. First of all, Bruce Ames. That's Bruce over there. Howard Byrne. Daniel Boyarin. There's Daniel back there. John Casita. John Clark. Marvin Cohen. Fred Cruz, John Prausnitz, Paul Richards, Randy Sheckman, Barry Stroud. Okay, and anybody I missed? Apparently not. And two individuals were chosen to give the 2010 lectures: Walter Alvarez, Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences, and Leslie Kirk, Professor of Classics and Comparative Literature. Leslie, can I tell them what happened? And I'm just extraordinarily pleased to announce that Leslie just got a letter today informing her that she was elected to the American Philosophical Society, which is the most selective of all scholarly societies. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of hearing from Professor Alvarez, the first of our two faculty lecturers. And Professor Kirk will deliver her faculty research lecture on May 11th. Born and raised in Berkeley, and a professor at UC Berkeley since 1977, geologist Walter Alvarez has changed the way we view the history of the Earth. As a young geologist, Walter found traces of iridium in Gubbio, Italy. And iridium, which is either a 4D or 5D, can't remember, transition metal. Anyway, it's Walter, where are you? Is it 4D or 5D? Anyway, 4D, I think, is common in comets and asteroids. It shows I'm slipping as chancellor. I used to have the periodic table memorized, but can't do it anymore. Working together with his father, the late Nobel Prize-winning physicist Luis Alvarez, and others, he proposed that based on evidence from the iridium measurements, sea creatures and many other forms of life, including dinosaurs, were killed off in a global catastrophe that followed a comet or meteor impact 65 million years ago. This hypothesis was later confirmed by the discovery of a huge crater of the right size and age. Scientists have since proposed other extinction events that may also have played a role. Professor Alvarez told the story of his discovery in his best-selling 1997 book, T-Rex and the Crater of Doom. In 2008, he was awarded the highly esteemed Vetlesen Prize, considered by many as the earth scientist equivalent of the Nobel Prize. The Vetlesen Prize committee said, "For more than a century, the dominant view of how Earth evolved was one of uniformitarianism, a slow, gentle change caused by processes observable today." His work proved that major catastrophic events can shape the evolution of our planet. Professor Alvarez's most recent book, published in 2008, is The Mountain of St. Francis. It traces Italy's geological history with a focus on Italian geologists and their groundbreaking discoveries. His journey begins in Gubbio, the town where he first observed evidence that led to his hypothesis of the catastrophic event, and traces the geological history of Italy's mountains from the Apennines to the Alps. He likens his interests in rocks and quarries to history books and libraries. Through their unchanging nature, they preserve the way they formed, whether 1 million years ago or 1,000 million years ago. Professor Alvarez has a deep interest in the connection between human and geological history and has developed a course at Berkeley called Big History. Right, like that. And I see we have some students right up. Right. It explores the commonalities in the evolution of the cosmos, the formation of the Earth, and the great revolutions through which humanity has achieved its present dominance. And maybe he's going to tell us by the end of the lecture how long that dominance is expected to last. In addition to the Vetlesen Prize, Professor Alvarez has received the Penrose Medal, which is the highest honor of the Geologic Society of America. He's also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, and holds several honorary doctorates. And actually, I'm pleased to see, Walter, we have one in common, which is the Colorado School of Mines, which is probably more likely for you than for me. But right, thank you. He's an honorary citizen of 2 Italian towns, including Gubbio. It's my great pleasure to invite Professor Alvarez to speak to us this afternoon on the topic of Earth history in the broadest possible context.
Thank you, Chancellor Burgeon, and thanks to all of you for coming to the first faculty research lecture this afternoon. Please be sure to come to Leslie Kirk's lecture on May 11th as well. Now, giving this lecture would be a great honor and a profound moment for any professor at Berkeley, but perhaps even more so for me, because my father gave this lecture in 1962. And he told me once that of all the recognitions he ever received, this was the one that meant the most to him because it came from his own colleagues here at Berkeley. I feel the same way, and it's a special privilege to follow in his path almost 50 years later. Now, my father's faculty research lecture was entitled Adventures of a Physicist. I could have called my lectures Adventures of a Geologist, and indeed I do want to tell you about some of the interesting things that have happened during my career in geology. But I want to do more than that. As a geologist, I think of myself as a historian of the Earth, and I would like for you to leave this lecture with an appreciation of some of the really remarkable things that we've learned about the history of our planet in the last half century, and even more about how Earth history fits into the much broader context of the history of everything we're able to observe, of cosmos, Earth, life, and humanity. Well, 50 years ago, I was a college student just beginning my study of geology, and I learned about 2 great discoveries geologists had made about the character of Earth history. First and foremost was the concept of uniformitarianism. And Chancellor, we all get tongue-tied on that one. Boiled down to its essentials, this view of Earth history maintains that nothing in Earth's past ever happened at a faster rate or by a different mechanism than what we can observe today. The English geologist Charles Lyell originally formulated the uniformitarian viewpoint about 1830, and by the time I was a student, it was considered the greatest contribution ever made by geology to the scientific understanding of nature. It has turned out to be wrong. Second, I learned that the German meteorologist, Alfred Wegener, had made the preposterous suggestion in the early 20th century that the continents drift, that they move around on the surface of the Earth. Wegener thought they had once all been assembled into a supercontinent that he named Pangaea, all the lands, which subsequently fragmented into the several continents we know today. I learned, as a student, that the geologists around 1930, knowing much more about the Earth than the meteorologist Wegener did, defeated this silly idea and replaced it with the much more reasonable view of continental fixism, the understanding that the continents have always been where they are today, separated by permanent ocean basins. It turned out that Wegener was right after all. The continents do move, and the oceans are ephemeral. It's been my great good fortune to have lived through the two scientific revolutions in which uniformitarianism was overthrown and continental drift was vindicated, and to have played a very small role in the first revolution and a bit more of a role in the second one. Let me tell you about these developments and how they led to the much more interesting view of Earth history that we have today. The overthrow of continental fixism began in the early 1960s through the work of a geologist at Princeton named Harry Hess, who was interested in tectonics. That's the evolution of continents, ocean basins, and mountain ranges. Hess proposed that ocean basins are not permanent. He suggested that new ocean crust is produced at the crest of the mid-ocean ridges and expands laterally in a process that came to be known as seafloor spreading. Oops, excuse me, that one that you see happening there, spreading and going sideways. And this motion would carry the continents away from each other. Now, Hess's first paper about this idea was so scandalous that for a couple of years it was unpublishable and was available only in manuscript form. Well, it was my great good fortune to be one of Harry Hess's last graduate students just at that time. And although I did not yet have enough experience to contribute to the early stages of a great scientific revolution, I certainly had a ringside seat. Uncle Harry, as we secretly called him, sent me off to the Guajira Peninsula, the northernmost point in South America, to do a field study of what I gradually realized was the northern tip of the Andean mountain chain. In retrospect, there was a charming irony in this part of my career track. As I was working on my thesis, Hess's seafloor spreading was developing into the theory of plate tectonics. Plate tectonics, which overthrew continental fixism, showed that the surface of the Earth is divided into a dozen or so enormous spherical caps, or plates, each of which moves rigidly, deforming only at boundaries with other plates. To a first approximation, then, and this was the heart of plate tectonics, geologic patterns are simple. But I found myself in the Caribbean, which is an unusual area of enormous geological complexity. In the Guajira Peninsula, the tip of the Andes was bent around to the east, broken apart and difficult to recognize. My first scientific publication was entitled "The Fragmented Andean Belt of Northern Colombia." Small, intricate geological puzzles like this were antithetical to the broad, simple patterns of plate tectonics, and I found myself somehow out of sync with that new concept. And there was another irony to what was happening then in geology. As the evidence accumulated to show that Uncle Harry was absolutely right about seafloor spreading, it became clear that the Atlantic Ocean basin, so wide that it takes all night to fly over in a jet airliner, had grown over a couple of 100 million years at about the rate that your fingernails grow. It was a most delightfully uniformitarian discovery. And although astronauts were even then visiting the moon and recognizing the fundamental role of catastrophic impacts in their craters, most geologists, fascinated with the slow movements of plate tectonics like there, just weren't paying attention. Uniformitarianism came through the 1960s and the 1970s intact and even strengthened. Well, my thesis work started me on a lifelong fascination with the tectonic tectonics of complicated, intricate parts of the Earth. But it also started me on a fascination with prehistory and human history. Millie and I spent our honeymoon in the roadless Guajira Desert, living with smugglers and with the proud, independent people called the Wayuu, who had never been subjugated by the Spanish or by the Colombians either. We wondered how the Wayuu had gotten to this place and how their language and customs had evolved. And in the area I was mapping, along the coast there was a cape called Cabo de la Vela. We learned that this cape had been discovered and named in 1499 by Juan de la Cosa, the owner and captain of the Santa Maria, the flagship of Columbus. Juan de la Cosa was on all four of Columbus's voyages. He was the first European to explore the northern coast of South America, and in 1500 he made the first undisputed map of the New World. And there's the Guajira, there's Cuba, there's Hispaniola. Now, there was a remarkable hill of serpentine that I mapped in my thesis area that looks much like a ship in the distance. And it's not surprising that Juan de la Cosa named it Cape of the Sail. This dramatic connection to important historical events was the start for Millie and me of what I've started to call historical mindedness. It made us want to live in Europe to better understand what lay behind the New World setting in which we had grown up. Fortunately, I was able to find a job with an oil company that sent us to the Netherlands and a year later to Libya, where we lived in Tripoli for 2 more years and witnessed Colonel Gaddafi's revolution. Over the next few years, we had a chance to visit, live in, or work in Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia. This led to a fascination with the geology and history of the Sahara, the Nile, and the Mediterranean. On a trip to Egypt, we saw the unfinished obelisk in the ancient granite quarry of Aswan, abandoned when a crack appeared in the rock. And we learned that Bronze Age Egyptians had been able to cut through granite that can barely be dented by steel by crushing it with volcanic rock hammerstones. Also, at Aswan, in that year, the High Dam was under construction. And years later, we were to learn that the Soviet and Egyptian geologists planning the foundations had discovered a buried valley under the Nile, 300 meters deep, reaching 200 meters below sea level, which is the limit beneath which rivers cannot cut. And meanwhile, again, we didn't know this at the time, petroleum geologists drilling beneath the Nile Delta discovered a filled-in canyon under Cairo that is wider, deeper, and longer than the Grand Canyon. And the few geologists who knew about these buried valleys were completely mystified. How could you erode a canyon below sea level? Then in Libya, I learned about the French geologists working in neighboring Algeria who had discovered grooved bedrock, which you can see the grooves here, which is evidence for glaciers, dating from the Ordovician, about 450 million years ago, in the middle of the blazing hot Sahara Desert. They also were utterly mystified. And close to the glacial grooves, I saw beautiful petroglyphs depicting wild animals carved by our human ancestors in what is now an arid, hyper-arid wasteland. The Sahara was just rich in wonderful mysteries. Well, the Mediterranean also fascinated me, full of microcontinental islands like Sardinia and Corsica, surrounded by little ocean basins. It was much too complicated to explain by simple plate tectonics. It was reminiscent of the Caribbean complexity, and I started to write about microplate tectonics. The techniques of paleomagnetism allowed geologists to read what we might call fossil compasses frozen into rocks when they're deposited. Following up on Dutch studies a few years earlier, I showed that the islands of Corsica and Sardinia form a microplate that had rotated away from the coast of France. A colleague in Paris wrote to thank me because, as he said, now the Corsicans know that they really are French. Not only is the Mediterranean full of little islands, it's full of little mountain ranges, going back to 50 million years ago. Mountains deformed and driven up when Europe and Africa collided. The Alps are the best known, but there are other little scattered mountain ranges, or what geologists call orogenic belts, where oro means mountains, it doesn't mean gold. These little orogenic belts are found in Corsica, in Sardinia, not in Corsica, and in Calabria, and this part of Algeria over here, and also in southern Spain. Well, when I moved the various microcontinents back to restored positions, the mountain belt pieces, here shown in pink, all lined up into a formerly continuous mountain belt, which is subsequently broken up into the fragments we see today. My first paper, The Fragmented Andean Belt of Northern Colombia, was soon followed by a paper with the title, Fragmentation of the Alpine Orogenic Belt by Microplate Dispersal. It was becoming a theme, and the complexity of the Caribbean and the Mediterranean made me wonder about the validity of the much simpler picture emerging from the plate tectonic revolution. Well, two Italian geologists and I proposed a movement history for the Mediterranean microplates and argued that Calabria here had once been attached to Sardinia and is now actively moving southeastward, as you see in these two pictures. My current grad student, Dave Shimabukuro, is working out some of the details of this movement for his thesis. But we ran into a problem. Other Mediterranean geologists objected to this scenario. They pointed out that the northwestern Tyrrhenian Sea, which opened in the wake of the Calabrian block, contains a layer of salt about 6 million years, that's in here, 6 million years old, from the time that geologists call the Messinian. This deep salt layer could be seen on seismic reflection profiles and had been dated. They correctly pointed out that Calabria could not still be moving if its wake is full of salt deposited 6 million years ago. Well, we were worried, but we predicted that the salt would not be found in the southeastern Tyrrhenian Sea over here, immediately behind Calabria, if it's moving as we had inferred. Well, a few years later, the southeastern Tyrrhenian Sea was drilled, and there was no salt beneath that part of the sea. So our hypothesis was nicely confirmed. But a big question remained: has Italy rotated? After living for a year in Italy, where that question intrigued me, Millie and I moved to New York, where Columbia University has a big geological and oceanographic lab. There I met Bill Lowry, a Scottish paleomagnetist, and we decided to see if we could detect a rotation of the Italian peninsula. Until then, most paleomagnetic work had been done on volcanic rocks, which have lots of magnetic minerals. But new, very sensitive digital magnetometers had just become available, and we hoped we could measure the remnant magnetism of very much more weakly magnetic sedimentary rocks. And thus, Bill and I met the wonderful limestones called the Scaglia, which are almost unique to Italy. Although nobody then knew it, these sedimentary rocks have turned out to carry arguably the best record of Earth history available to geologists anywhere. They were deposited in moderately deep water, so there were no waves or currents to scramble them. But now they've been pushed up above sea level during the building of the Apennine Mountains, so we can study them. The Scaglia limestones were deposited grain by grain as particles settled down from the surface water, and they record more aspects of Earth history than you can imagine. In the early 1970s, Bill Lowry and I found that we could indeed measure the magnetic remnants of the Scaglia. Unfortunately, we could not use these fossil compasses to determine the rotation history of the Italian peninsula. The problem was that there are thousands of beds in the Scaglia, like playing cards in a deck. And if there were even a tiny rotational slip on each bedding plane, the upper beds would be disconnected from the Italian crust deep down. And sadly, as a study of microplate tectonics, it was not a success. However, by great good luck, we stumbled on something much better. You may have heard it said that in science sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart, and this was a case. As we measured the magnetic remnants of the Scaglia near the little medieval city of Gubbio, we discovered that some beds are magnetized in the direction of the present magnetic field. North is that way. The present field goes like this. But some were in the opposite direction, up and to the south, like that. And we had found a historical record of the polarity reversals of the Earth's magnetic field. And even better, the Scaglia limestone is full of little single-celled organisms called foraminifera, or forams, which are the best paleontological dating tool we have. We could tie the reversals into the geological timescale. And even better than that, we later found volcanic ash layers in the Scaglia with mineral grains that could be dated radiometrically in years. So in the first of its wonderful contributions to Earth history, the Scaglia limestone allowed us to tie together the three main ways of determining the ages of rocks: fossils, magnetic polarity, and radiometric dating. I might not previously have thought of myself as an Earth historian, but by that time I surely did. Now, curiously, this discovery overcame the disconnect between the revolutionary but simple patterns of plate tectonics that Harry Hess was figuring out and my own work on complex microplate tectonics. It had turned out, and that was, I'm behind. Okay, this is the history that we found at Gubbio, and this is the next one, which shows that the reversal history of the Earth's magnetic field is also recorded as magnetic stripes on the sea floor, which are measurable by oceanographic ships. And these stripes allowed geologists to reconstruct former positions of the drifting continents. But you could only date those seafloor stripes very, very roughly. So when we found the same sequence of magnetic reversal stripes in the Scaglia limestone, we were able to date the seafloor stripes by correlation. Then the people doing plate tectonics could place accurate dates on the reconstructions. So our paleomagnetic work, undertaken as a study of complex microplate tectonics, ended up as an important contribution to large-scale simple plate tectonics. In research, you never quite know where you're going to end up. But the Scaglia had only begun to tell us about Earth history. I spent a lot of time with the Italian paleontologist Isabella Premoli Silva at our outcrops near Gubbio, and she pointed out the level in the Scaglia where the larger single-celled foraminifera nearly became extinct. This was the Cretaceous-Tertiary, or KT, mass extinction right here, a time when large numbers of taxa suddenly died out. I'm going to call it Cretaceous-Tertiary. Sometimes now you will see it called Cretaceous-Paleogene because there's been a change in the official nomenclature. Now, the reason for the abrupt KT extinction was at that point a long-standing mystery. The abrupt foram extinction at Gubbio looked catastrophic. But most geologists preferred a gradualistic explanation because of the dominance of uniformitarian thinking. Well, about that time, in 1977, I came to Berkeley, and using a sample of the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary as bait, I lured my physicist father into an unanticipated interest in geology, and we decided to see if we could solve the mystery of the mass extinction. I won't take the time to tell you all the details now because they're in the little book the Chancellor mentioned. But by good fortune, we met Frank Asaro and Helen Michael at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and they measured the iridium content of a clay layer at the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary in the Gubbio Scaglia. Iridium is rare in all solar system material, but it's essentially absent in sediments like the Scaglia because most of the Earth's iridium is alloyed with iron and it's down in the Earth's core. Well, Frank and Helen discovered this amazing thing. It was an enormous anomaly of iridium Check, this is a graph width here. The peak is 15 graph widths off to the right. It was an astonishing anomaly that Frank and Helen found. And after we spent a year confirming this anomaly and considering possible explanations, we published a paper in 1980 proposing what has come to be known as the Berkeley Theory, that the Iridium anomaly and the mass extinction were both due to an impact of a 10-kilometer asteroid or comet on the Earth. And Jan Smit and some other people quickly confirmed that the Iridium anomaly was present in other KT exposures. And soon, other geologists found additional evidence for a KT impact, especially shocked quartz and shock melted spherules like this. Well, the Berkeley theory ignited a firestorm of objections from uniformitarian geologists and paleontologists and triggered a decade of research on the KT boundary all over the world. In the process, through the 1980s, there were a number of major meetings about the KT boundary, and a most remarkable interdisciplinary culture developed. It was quickly obvious that people from astronomy and paleontology to chemistry and physics and geology would need to be able to communicate. Those who learned to do this flourished in this culture, and those who didn't soon dropped out. Well, I found that I just loved working with people from remote specialties. I loved learning to speak their jargon, and an interdisciplinary approach has characterized my work ever since. In particular, the impact-extinction research on the KT boundary forced me to learn about cosmic history, asteroids and comets, and about life history and extinctions, adding to the interest I already had in Earth history and human history. Well, by 1990, after 10 years, the evidence for a KT impact was extremely strong, but there was one major loose string. The Berkeley theory predicted that there should be a huge impact crater on Earth dating from exactly KT boundary time, 65 million years ago. And yet, in spite of intensive searching by a large number of scientists, no such crater had been found. We pointed out that the crater could have been subducted or covered with sediment or ice, but the failure to find a crater remained at best a disappointment, and at worst a serious embarrassment and a major objection to the Berkeley theory. And that was what we were looking for. And finally, in 1991, the problem seemed solved when we learned about a huge buried crater beneath Puerto Chicxulub in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. The crater was at least roughly the age of the KT boundary, and we needed to test whether it was exactly that age. The next year, with Jan Smit and Sandro Montanari, we found a wonderful outcrop in northeastern Mexico. This is the neatest outcrop I have ever seen, with impact and tsunami deposits here scoured down into deep water sediments of very late Cretaceous and overlain by the exact base of the Tertiary. It seemed overwhelmingly clear that these were deposits resulting from a huge nearby impact, which could only be the Chicxulub event, and dating from exactly KT boundary time. We concluded that Chicxulub was indeed the site of a huge impact responsible for the KT mass extinction, and most of the geologists and paleontologists who went to Mexico to look at the evidence agreed with us. There was one group, however, led by Gerda Keller at Princeton, who did not agree. For nearly 2 decades, the Keller group has maintained that the Chicxulub impact occurred 300,000 years before the mass extinction, and thus could not be its cause. In a series of papers, they've presented observations purporting to demonstrate this difference in timing. Well, others, especially Jan Smit, have challenged their observation, pointing out that Keller's data always come from sediments slightly older than the KT boundary, which have been strongly disturbed by seismic shaking and the passage of a tsunami, and thus they're difficult to interpret. Nevertheless, Keller's work has received a lot of attention and has led some observers to think that the connection between the Chicxulub crater and the KT extinction has been disproven. And so, after having our work attacked for so long, it was a great satisfaction early last month when an article appeared in Science with 41 co-authors from 12 countries who have examined all of the relevant evidence in great detail and concluded, quote, a single ejecta-rich deposit compositionally linked to the Chicxulub impact is globally distributed at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. The temporal match between the ejecta layer and the onset of the extinctions, and the agreement of ecological patterns in the fossil record with modeled environmental perturbations, for example, darkness and cooling, lead us to conclude that the Chicxulub impact triggered the mass extinction, end quote. That felt good. Well, with this nearly unanimous consensus, we may now be able to focus our attention on the really interesting question. There have been 6 great mass extinctions. The last 4 coincide at least roughly with massive eruptions of basaltic lava, while the last one also coincides exactly with a giant impact. Is this a simple coincidence or a profound coincidence? Nobody knows at this point. Okay, now what I'd like to do is to broaden the context of Earth history. Broaden it all the way. For the last 30 years or so, I've thought of myself as an Earth historian with a side interest in human history, with a research trajectory that's brought considerable familiarity with cosmic history and life history, and with a delight in interdisciplinary questions. I began to wonder whether I could tie all of these interests into a single framework to study the history of everything, or at least everything we have any possibility of knowing about. Maybe one could teach a course about the history of everything, maybe even formulate some kind of interdisciplinary research agenda. By good fortune, I learned about the Anglo-Australian professor of Russian history, David Christian, who had already invented the field I was thinking about, which he called Big History. And by the way, his book is called Maps of Time, published by UC Press, and it's fascinating. David has the unusual view that there's no logical place to begin a history curriculum more recently than the Big Bang. You can imagine the meeting of the history department faculty when he presented that concept. For 15 years or so, David had been teaching a course in big history at Macquarie University, having recruited some scientist colleagues to help him get started. David and his first disciple, Fred Spear in Holland, and Cynthia Brown at Dominican University were very generous and helpful to me. And now Berkeley is one of only a couple of dozen universities around the world that has a course in big history. This has been the most exhilarating intellectual experience of my career as a teaching professor. Big history seems to attract the most thoughtful, widely interested, and motivated of our Berkeley students, from freshmen to seniors, from every major you can imagine. I've seen quite a few of my big history students from the last 4 years here today, and I want to thank you all for being so exciting to teach. Together, in this class, in these 4 years, we have learned that one of the hardest parts in understanding all of history is visualizing the timescales. For human beings who may, with luck, live a single century, 1,000 years is almost beyond comprehension, let alone the 5,000 years of recorded human history. And that's just the beginning of the problem. The history of Earth and of life on Earth go back almost 1 million times further than written human history, back to almost 5,000 million years ago. And the history of the cosmos goes back 3 times further than that. How can you possibly wrap your mind around timescales like those? My colleagues and I in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science deal with these numbers all the time. We know what happened when. We can speak about it glibly. We have no more gut feeling of what 10 million years is than anybody else does. Well, last spring, in the big history class, I had a remarkable senior named Roland Sakow who did a term project in which he suggested using computer graphic zoom technology to visualize all the timescales in the history of everything. The class loved it, and so did I. And ever since then, Roland has been working with me to bring to life what we are calling chronozoom. Roland, it's your time. So this is chronozoom. It turned out that the best available technology was a Microsoft experimental software package called Deep Zoom. With the help of Michael Katz and the Industrial Research Alliances group here at Berkeley and Darren Green at Microsoft Research, we got in touch with Bill Crow and his group at Microsoft Live Labs, who are developing Deep Zoom. They got really interested and have been just wonderful in making their software do exactly what we need. I'm so grateful to them, to Goldie Jodary, to Karan Singh, Melinda Minch, and Asta Roseway for working with Roland to make chronozoom a reality. Scientists have benefited enormously from the development of new tools and instruments. Geologists, for example, have learned ever more about the Earth by using tools like the scanning electron microscope, the electron microprobe, and the mass spectrometer. Clearly, a new field like big history also needs new tools, and we suggest that chronozoom may be the first of these new tools. And so now, after a year of development, we would like to unveil chronozoom, although it's still in a slightly rough demo version. If you like it and are interested in exploring it yourself, it will be available on the web at this address as of the end of this lecture. Go home and try it out. We would love to hear your reactions and your suggestions. And by the way, you'll be able to do just what we're doing now, because what you're going to see right now is streaming on the web. Okay, so I'm supposed to click that. There we go. And ready to start? Okay, so let me introduce you to chronozoom with Roland up here piloting our time machine. So first, we'll travel backward in history, with chronozoom giving us a graphic understanding of the vastness of time, and then we're going to return to the present with chronozoom in its research tool mode. Let's start at Millennium Eve on December 31st, 2000. There are many themes we could look at in human history, and hopefully someday chronozoom will have a large selection of them. But for today, in keeping with our topic of Earth history, we have chosen to look at the way in which human beings have come to understand our planet. Here is the second millennium that has recently ended. And here in blue are the episodes in geology that I personally have had the good fortune to be involved in. Now, zooming out, we can place them in the broader context of modern geology, seeing the plate tectonic revolution, Alfred Wegener's continental drift, and the 19th century geological revolution, from Hutton's discovery of deep time to Darwin's theory of evolution. Now we can see back as far as, in the Western tradition, there are studies of the Earth that we might consider scientific. Although I don't have time to go over them all in detail, you can look at them online tonight. Another zoom, and we've reached the limit of written human history about 5,000 years ago, symbolized here by ancient Egypt in the timeline across the bottom. There was not much scientific geology early on, but people made skillful use of Earth resources, building the pyramids, shaping Egyptian granite into obelisks. And if during this zoom you had been watching the New Year's Eve with which we started, you would have seen it shrink into less than 1 pixel in the upper right-hand corner of this image. This is the problem of timescales that makes it so hard for us human beings to comprehend all of human history. But we're just at the beginning of our difficulties if we want to understand the timescale of big history. Earth history goes back to 5,000 million years ago. Now, it may be helpful to know that Earth history is about 1 million times longer than human history, but that does not really convey a gut understanding of the chronology. We're finding that chronozoom can help our understanding, especially if you spend time playing around, zooming in and out and panning back and forth. So now, let us zoom slowly back in time. I will just point out when we pass the limits of prehistory, life history, and Earth history. So here we have zoomed out 1,000 times and reached the limit of human prehistory about 5 million years ago. Another factor of 1,000, and we're back to the formation of the Earth about 4.5 billion years ago. One last zoom by a factor of 3, and we can see all of cosmic history back to the origin of our universe and of time about 13.7 billion years ago. The origin of the universe in the Big Bang is understood by cosmologists back to the first 10 to the minus 43 seconds. Think about that. And the only practical way to show it is on a logarithmic plot, which we've done for the first billion years. So this is chronozoom in its time visualization mode. We hope you like it and that you will take some time to explore it online. And I really do want to thank Roland Sakow, along with Bill Crow, Goldie Jodary, Karan Singh, Melinda Minch, and Asta Roseway for bringing it to life. Now, let us return slowly to the present, thinking about how chronozoom might be useful as a research tool. We're only beginning to explore these possibilities, so I will be showing you ideas rather than results. Now, across the bottom here, you see the divisions of geological time, and above that, the decay of various radioactive isotopes produced during the supernova that triggered the assembly of the sun and the planets. And at the top, the growth of the Earth, here's its assembly, and of its iron core here in purple during the accretion of our planet. Panning across toward the younger times to the right, we come to the last 542 million years, which geologists call the Phanerozoic, or the time of abundant, visible fossil life. These are the times about which geologists know the most because of the rich fossil control. But now, with radiometric dating, our understanding of times earlier than 542 million years is rapidly increasing. For example, geologists are now working out the history of the supercontinent cycle, in which a landmass containing most or all of the continental crust breaks up into several modest-sized continents, which then break up and reassemble someplace else into a new supercontinent. As a result of this work, many hundreds of paleocontinental maps have been published. Like these for 560 and 540 million years ago, these were made by Ron Blakey at Northern Arizona, and there's so many and they're so complicated that they're very hard to keep track of and digest. With the zooming capability of the new tool here, we can display hundreds of these maps in chronological order so they can be studied and evaluated. In addition, we can build in new kinds of diagrams like this one that uses the concept of the biological cladogram to clarify the inferred history of supercontinent breakup and reassembly. For example, here is the gradual assembly from 700 to 500 million years ago of Gondwana in black. This is the supercontinent. Now, the vertical red bars mark the collision of continental fragments, like here, and the blue bars mark rifting events in which larger continental masses are broken up. And notice here how Goldie's team has placed a scale, a time scale, across the top, so you can always see where in time you are located. Panning toward the right, towards younger times, we see the collision of Gondwana here with Laurussia, which means North America plus Europe, that built the Appalachian Mountains right here. and assembled the full supercontinent of Pangaea, which then fragmented into the familiar continents of today, and that's what's happening over here. It was this fragmentation that Alfred Wegener correctly understood in the 1920s. Chronozoom has been allowing us to compare and test the many possible histories that have been suggested. We can also look at the history of impacts. Here are all the major impacts back to 400 million years ago, with arrow length proportional to crater diameter. The 170-kilometer Chicxulub crater produced a mass extinction. The 100-kilometer craters at Manicouagan in Quebec, at Papagai in Siberia, and at Chesapeake Bay did not. And here is a most exciting new discovery. This is just a wonderful one, made by Birger Schmitz in Sweden. There was a huge storm of impacts that pummeled the Earth for 1 million years or so after a collision broke up an asteroid between Mars and Jupiter. It happened during the Ordovician. Remember that? 488 to 444 million years ago. This was the time of the Saharan glaciation that so intrigued me when we lived in Libya. The Ordovician glaciation in the Sahara was a normal glaciation, but here are, a bit older, are two superglaciations, or snowball Earth events, in which the ocean's surface was frozen from one pole to another. Chronozoom lets us plot together all these different kinds of historical information at different timescales. Normally, all of this information is presented separately in different diagrams, usually with the time axis running in different directions, and is really hard to make sense of. But I'm optimistic that bringing it all together in Chronozoom will lead us to a new synthetic understanding of Earth history. Let's now turn briefly to the history of life. Because of its enormous complexity, let's just focus on the ancestry of human beings shown in the upper part of this diagram. And here is the beginning with Luca. That's not an Italian guy, that's the last universal common ancestor. And branching into the single-celled archaea and the eubacteria. Now, panning towards younger times, we see the endosymbiotic event here that produced our eukaryotic cells, and the initial branchings that eventually led to us up here. In this drawing, the lineage ancestral to Homo sapiens is always at the top. You'll be able to follow it up there. The so-called outgroups that do not lead to us, like plants and fungi, are shown below, and we've left off their own complex pattern of branches. But here we encounter a major problem that could be studied with Chronozoom. You can derive the history of life based either on fossils or on DNA. Now, the fossil-based paleontological record is very detailed and can be tied into the geological timescale, dated in millions of years. But it is not always easy to figure out the genealogical relationships, and the branching dates can be suspect, for the oldest members of a group may not be preserved in the fossil record. On the other hand, if you compare the DNA of various living organisms, the closer the match in DNA, the more closely related they are. But this approach has its own limitations. You can't get reliable DNA from extinct lineages, and there's no direct way to date the branching times. So perhaps not surprisingly, the two approaches do not give exactly the same tree of life. Now, the most troubling discrepancy that's really bothering people who are concerned with the history of life is in dating the branching times. The DNA tree, which is usually dated on the basis of the dubious assumption of constant mutation rate, commonly gives nodes substantially older than the fossil record does. Now, in this drawing of the family tree of humanity, I've used the DNA data, but only because there is a recent systematic compilation called the Time Tree of Life that gives a coherent, internally consistent evolutionary tree with assigned dates. We really need a similar compilation for the fossil-based tree, and then we need a rigorous comparison. Chronozoom should help, as you will see as we trace the pathway on towards human beings. Here we see the eumetazoa, or the true multicellular animals, splitting off from sponges. and then dividing into animals with radial symmetry, like corals and jellyfish, and those with bilateral symmetry, like us. A few more branches, and we come to a major problem. The Cambrian explosion of multicellular life, which is a really important feature of the fossil record, is simply not apparent from the DNA evidence. Nobody knows what the answer to that is right now. Now, tracing our chordate and vertebrate ancestors, we come to a branch or a clade called the Gnathostomata here, or jaw-mouthed animals. And here you see the problem of dating. For this DNA-based tree places the origin of the jaw at about 600 million years. You can see there 0.6 billion up there. Whereas the fossil record is quite clear that the jaw appears, guess when? In the Ordovician. Maybe 460 million years ago, when Birger-Schmitz's asteroid shower was falling and glaciers covered the central Sahara. A few more branches, and mammals split off from the reptiles. More and more mammals split off, and our lineage continues into the primates. We continue through old world monkeys and apes and hominids, and then to humans and our extinct relatives. Now, in a moment, we're going to look more closely at human prehistory, but first let's zoom quickly out to see the entire history of life and Earth, and then back in once more to place humanity in our big history context. Okay, now let's have a closer look at prehistory, human prehistory. Here at 4.4 million years ago is Ardipithecus ramidus, described last fall by Berkeley's Tim White and many colleagues. And a bit younger, at 3.2 million years, is Australopithecus afarensis, the famous Lucy. Continuing to younger times, we see other Australopithecines and the various species of genus Homo, leading to our own species, which is the only hominid which is still alive at the present time. Now, across the bottom, you can see the geological time scale, the geomagnetic polarity sequence, and the oxygen isotope record of glaciations from the present back to a bit more than 5.5 million years ago. The orange box over here indicates a remarkable event in Earth history, the MSC, or Messinian Salinity Crisis, in which tectonic uplift blocked the passage between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean simply dried up by evaporation, turning into a desert about 2 kilometers below sea level, and about the size of the United States. It was this evaporation that left a thick layer of salt on the floor of the Mediterranean, all except for the southeastern corner of the Tyrrhenian Sea, which opened after the salinity crisis, as my Italian colleagues and I predicted in the 1970s. Now, an event like the salinity crisis would obviously have many geological consequences. Let's just focus on one, the evolution of the Nile River. When the level of the Mediterranean Sea dropped by 2 kilometers, the Nile was able to erode down to that level and also to erode far back upstream to the south. And this, of course, led to the origin of this Grand Canyon-sized filled-in chasm below Cairo and of the smaller buried valley beneath Aswan. I realize that I'm running a little longer on this than I wanted to. Shall I go through it all, or shall I jump ahead? Continue? Okay, all right, I will. Thank you. Okay, so the Egyptian geologist Rushdie Said was the first to formulate a coherent theory of the Nile. The Nile is the most fascinating river. He based it on sediments along the Nile Valley. He recognized several different phases in which the river either deposited sediment or eroded away. But it was really hard to date these different phases because when you get back beyond 50,000 years ago, the limit of radiocarbon dating, there was no way to obtain ages directly. Now, Said's preferred chronology is shown in blue, while other geologists have suggested slightly different histories shown in pink and green. And Eo-Nile is the name that Said gave to the river that eroded the Great Canyon when sea level was low in the Mediterranean. Now, that river, of course, just simply ceased to exist when the Atlantic broke into the Mediterranean desert and suddenly filled it up and filled up that long canyon going all the way back up to Aswan. As the elongate gulf filled with sediment, a new river, the Paleo-Nile, gradually extended its mouth downstream. Our different geologists have different ideas about just when this happened. You can see here and here. We then enter a complicated interval in which sometimes there was a Nile fed by abundant rains farther south in Africa, and sometimes the Nile did not reach the Mediterranean at all. It just simply evaporated before it got there. As you can see, there's no agreement about the timing or even the nature of these phases, and my point is to show you how chronozoom might help resolve this ambiguity. Drill cores, this is a set of drill cores from the eastern Mediterranean, bring up white sediment interrupted by dark organic-rich layers called sapropels, these ones in here. Sapropels are thought to represent time when the sea bottom was oxygen-starved, so that scavengers could not live there and eat the organic matter that fell. Oxygen starvation was probably due to a layer of fresh water from the Nile that floated out over the sea surface of the Mediterranean, inhibiting overturn so that oxygen could not reach the bottom. So here you can see a sediment core cut into several segments with several numbered sapropels, 68, 70, 75, and so forth. And further to the right, you can see ages that have been assigned to some of these sapropels on the basis of the Earth's orbital Milankovitch rhythms, which provide a kind of clock. Now, you can see that the sediment record along the Nile Valley indicates a time when the river stopped flowing in here, different times for these different people. It's been hard to date. Meanwhile, there's an interval up here in which sapropels did not form, and this may well be the record in marine sediments of the arid phase during which the Nile did not reach the Mediterranean and spread fresh water out all over it. So maybe this will turn out, and the questions there, question marks, maybe this will turn out to be a new way to date the history of the Nile. Chronozoom encourages us to plot together data sets like these, which are rarely combined, and this may lead to improved chronologies and in turn to a fuller and better understanding of Earth history. And of course, we can understand all this Earth history as the foundation on which human history has been built, from the old kingdom of Egypt to the growing scientific understanding of Earth history to the times we live in today. So this is chronozoom. I hope you will explore it online, and if you have comments or suggestions, or if you would like to get involved in turning this pilot version into a fully operational tool for big history, please get in touch with Roland or me. There's contact information on the website. I had some other neat stuff I was going to tell you, but it's just gotten late. I think I better stop and urge you, if you have any interest in this, get in contact with us. If you'd like to get involved in turning chronozoom into a tool that would help you with your interest in human history or life history or cosmic history, we're just hoping we'll find some people who would like to do that. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you, Chancellor.
So even though we've gone over, we could keep people for hours. We don't really want to do that because there's a reception, but maybe, how about 2 questions?
2 questions, okay. Yes, the question is whether we've looked into the hypothesis that the North American large animals like mammoths and mastodons and saber-toothed tigers, whether they were killed off by an impact about 11,000 years ago. This is an idea that's in the process of being tested right now by a lot of people. I've had just a tiny bit to do with it, not very much. I guess I would have to say at this point there is quite a bit of skepticism. There has been no crater found. Now, you know that was a problem for us, but if you're looking for a crater that's only 11,000 years old, you ought to find it. It has been suggested that maybe it hit on the ice sheet that then covered Canada. But right now, it's a very active field of research, and people who there are people involved in it who are finding evidence in both directions. I don't think it's fair to say that, I think it's fair to say that it is not at all settled yet, but it probably will be within the next few years.
I wasn't completely clear on the duration of the event that occurred at the KT boundary. I wasn't clear on the duration of the event at the KT boundary, and I wasn't quite sure what you said about that.
It's really hard to get accurate numbers on how long a short event took that far into the past. The best number I know of comes from Jan Smith's work in southern Spain at a place called Caravaca. And there you can see that the layer that has all the iridium and all the spherules and everything is less than 1 millimeter thick. And if you compare that to the rate of sedimentation of those rocks, it represents no more than about 50 years. And it could very well be less than that. In fact, the modeling that people do suggests that it probably was only a matter of months or a year or two at most. So I don't think anybody's in the near future going to be able to say exactly how long it took, but it was very brief.
Okay, with that, let's thank Walter for a truly wonderful lecture.
Thank you.